War does not ask permission before it takes what it wants. It took the village of Hollow Reach in a single autumn night, scattering its people like seed thrown into wind. And among the scattered were two sisters, Cordelia and Marguerite Hale, aged 9 and 7, who were separated in the smoke and never saw each other again, or so each believed for the next 19 years. Cordelia was found half-starved on the road to Camden by a childless gentry family who raised her as a lady, taught her Latin and needlework, and eventually married her, at 21, to Edmund Voss, Duke of Thornfield, a cold, ambitious man twice her age, who required only two things of a wife: composure in public and a son in private. 5 years into the marriage, she had given him neither. The Marguerite's road was harder. She was raised by a tenant family who could not afford her, sold at 14 into service, and by chance, or by the particular cruelty of fate that enjoys closing circles, ended up a companion to the same Duke's ailing aunt, in the very household where her sister now lived as Duchess. Neither recognized the other at first. It was Cordelia who noticed it, the small crescent-shaped birthmark behind the girl's left ear, identical to the one behind her own, which their mother used to trace with her thumb and call the moon that never sets on you. They wept in a linen closet the first night they knew each other, and swore they would never again be parted. The Duke, informed that his wife's new companion was in fact her long-lost sister, saw not sentiment, but opportunity. Cordelia had failed to conceive. If the sister was of the same blood, of the same stock, perhaps she would not fail. It was not legal marriage in the fullest sense. No bishop would bless a duke with 2 wives. But Thornfield was a law unto himself in his own county, and he installed Marguerite in the West Wing as his second household wife. Arrangement whispered about, but never challenged, for no one challenged Thornfield. Marguerite conceived within the year. So at last did Cordelia. They carried their children through the same summer, walked the same gardens with the same swollen ankles, and went into labor on the same October night, 2 floors apart, while the Duke paced the length of his study and drank steadily through a bottle of French brandy he had been saving for exactly this occasion. Cordelia's child was a boy. Marguerite's was a girl. It should have been simple. It should have been, for Cordelia, a triumph. The official Duchess, delivering at last the heir the house had waited a decade for. But Marguerite came to her sister's bedside before the sun rose, her own daughter still warm from birth in her arms, and she was not weeping with joy. She was weeping with terror. "You do not understand what he does to women who fail him," Marguerite whispered. She had seen it. The aunt who raised her, cast out for a lesser offense. The maid dismissed without a reference for breaking a vase Thornfield's mother had once owned. "I am not his wife by law, Cordelia. I am his convenience. If I give him a daughter, he will send me back to nothing. You are safe. You are his Duchess, whatever child you bear. But I have only this to make me matter." Cordelia held her newborn son and looked at her sister's terror and made, in the space of an hour, the single worst decision of her life. Not out of foolishness, but out of a love so recently rediscovered that she could not yet see its cost. Let her have the boy, she thought. I am safe either way. I am safe. She did not yet understand that safety in Thornfield's house was never given. It was only ever borrowed, and always came due. By the time the household woke, the babies had changed hands. The physician, paid well and told to look away, recorded what he was told to record. The Duke was informed his companion wife had borne him a son, and his Duchess a daughter, and he received the news of the boy with the closest thing to genuine feeling Cordelia had ever seen cross his face, and received the news of his daughter with a flicker of contempt he did not bother to hide. It was done. It could not be undone without destroying them both, and so neither sister ever spoke of it again. Not to each other, not to God, not to the small dark-haired girl who was, in truth, Marguerite's blood, and who was named Iris, and given into Cordelia's arms to raise as her own. The cost came slowly, the way debts always do. Thornfield elevated Marguerite, gave her rooms nearer his own, spoke her name at dinner, with something approaching warmth. He grew colder toward Cordelia by degrees, a missed greeting, a seat moved further from his at table, a Christmas where her gift was forgotten entirely. Marguerite, drowning in guilt she could not confess without ruining them both, said nothing in her sister's defense. What could she say without saying everything? There were, in those 5 years, small cruelties that added themselves up like interest, compounding on a debt Cordelia had never truly agreed to owe. She was seated further from the fire at Christmas. Her requests to the housekeeper were answered a day later than Marguerite's, and always with less. When she walked the portrait gallery with Iris on rainy afternoons, teaching her the names of ancestors who were not, in truth, her daughter's ancestors at all, the housekeeper's girl would sometimes forget to light the sconces in that wing, as though even light itself had been quietly rationed away from her. Marguerite watched it happen and told herself, each time, that she would speak, that she would go to Edmund and confess the whole truth and beg him to be merciful to the sister who had given up everything so that Marguerite's own child might have a name. But each time she reached the door of his study, she thought of her own daughter, safe and warm and unknowing in Cordelia's arms, and the words dried up in her throat. She told herself it was only a little longer. She told herself Cordelia was strong. She told herself many things, in those years, that were easier to believe than the truth of what her silence was costing. It was a February morning, Iris not yet 5, still small enough to be carried on a hip through the long cold corridors, when Cordelia finally understood there would be no reprieve. She had gone to Edmund to ask, humbly, for coal enough to warm the nursery through a hard frost, and he had looked at her over the rim of his morning paper with an expression of such total, weary contempt that she felt something inside her, some last stubborn thread of hope, quietly give way. "You gave me a daughter, madam," he said, "when I required a son. I do not know what further obligation you imagine that entitles you to." She did not argue. She had learned, by then, that arguing only sharpened his cruelty rather than dulling it. She simply turned, gathered her daughter's small hand into her own, that same night, and left before the frost could turn to snow, taking with her 11 shillings, a single trunk of clothes too fine for the life she was about to live, and a silence about the true nature of the swap that she would carry, unbroken, to her grave. By the time Iris was 5 years old, Cordelia had been so thoroughly humiliated, so completely erased from the life of the house, that she took the only thing left to take, her daughter's hand, and walked out through the front gates of Thornfield in a grey November dawn, with 11 shillings sewn into her hem and nowhere in the world to go. They did not go far at first. A cousin's spare room in Leeds, a curate's charity in a parish outside York. But everywhere they went, Cordelia found a way to give her daughter an education she herself had been given, only by luck, insisting on lessons, even when there was barely bread enough for supper. She never told Iris the truth of the swap. She told her, instead, only that they had left a cruel man's house because cruel men did not deserve to keep what good there was in the world, and that Iris was to grow into a woman who needed no man's approval to know her own worth. It was, in its way, the truest thing Cordelia ever taught her, even if it was built upon the one lie she never found the courage to unmake. 19 years later, Iris Hale. She had taken back the name her mother whispered to her only once. The year before Cordelia died of a wasting fever in a rented room in Bath, too proud to write to the sister she had once loved, stood on the gravel drive of Ashdown Park with a single trunk and a letter of reference she had earned entirely on her own merits. She was 26 now, dark-haired, grey-eyed, and possessed of a composure that visitors to Ashdown often mistook for coldness, and which was, in truth, the calloused shell grown over a childhood of watching her mother go without, so that she might have a governess's education instead of a scullery maid's ignorance. She had trained herself in French, mathematics, botany, and the particular art of never letting her face show what she felt. It had served her through 4 households and 2 dismissals, one for correcting an employer's arithmetic in front of guests, one for refusing to overlook a young master's cruelty to the servants. She had learned early that a governess occupied a strange, suspended place in any household, too educated for the servants' hall, too poor for the drawing room, belonging fully to neither. It was a loneliness she had grown, over the years, almost fond of, in the way one grows fond of a familiar ache. It asked nothing of her that she could not give. It did not require her to explain a mother who had died with a secret unspoken on her lips, or a father she had never once met and did not, in her most honest moments, wish to. The letter offering her the position at Ashdown had come through an agency in London, brief and businesslike, mentioning only that the household required a governess of firm character, unafraid of grief in young charges. Iris had read those particular words 3 times before accepting. Most families wished their governesses to erase the appearance of grief as quickly as possible, to paper over loss with lessons and deportment until the household could pretend, at least at dinner, that nothing had ever gone wrong. A family willing to admit, in a hiring letter, that grief was to be met rather than managed away, seemed to Iris worth the long coach journey north. The journey itself had taken the better part of 2 days, through increasingly wild country, the neat hedgerows of the south giving way to stone walls and wide grey moorland that reminded her, though she did not care to examine why, of the last miles of road before Thornfield's gates. She had watched the countryside change through the coach window and reminded herself, as she always did before a new post, that she owed nothing to any house she entered beyond honest work, and that she would leave the moment any house tried to claim more of her than that. She had not been told much about Ashdown Park beyond the essentials. 2 children, aged 8 and 11, orphaned 18 months prior when their parents drowned crossing to Ireland, a guardian uncle who had inherited both the earldom and the children with equal reluctance, a household in need of steady hands. The butler who opened the door, a stooped, kindly man named Pruitt, looked at her trunk, her plain travelling cloak, and her very straight spine, and seemed to approve of all 3. "His lordship is not expecting you until this afternoon," Pruitt said, ushering her in regardless. "But he is a man who prefers things done sooner rather than later, so I imagine he'll forgive the trespass." The entrance hall of Ashdown was nothing like Thornfield's. No ancestral portraits glaring down in judgment, no marble cold enough to freeze a person's resolve. It was warm, a little disordered, with a child's forgotten hoop leaning against a Chippendale chair and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the back gardens. Iris felt something in her chest loosen slightly, though she did not trust it. She had learned not to trust warmth on first impression. Warmth could turn, the way Thornfield's house had turned on her mother. She was shown to the morning room to wait, and it was there, not in some grand formal study, but standing at a rain-streaked window, with his sleeves pushed up and ink on his hands, that she first saw Nathaniel Ferris, Earl of Ashdown. He was not what she had expected of a peer forced into unwilling guardianship. He looked, if anything, exhausted in the particular way of a man doing a job he had never trained for, and refused to do badly out of sheer stubbornness. He turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment, his grey eyes, sharper and colder than his rumpled appearance suggested, assessed her the way a man assesses a horse he intends to ride hard. "You're early," he said, not unkindly, simply an observation. "I am punctual, my lord." The two are often confused. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but its distant cousin. "Miss Hale, I was told you came with excellent references and very little patience for foolishness." Your informant was accurate on both counts. "Good," he said, and turned back to the window, as though the interview were already concluded to his satisfaction. "I have a great deal of foolishness in this house at present, and none of it is mine. Timothy believes himself capable of training the stable cat to fetch. Louisa has decided grief is best expressed by refusing to speak above a whisper for the past 3 weeks, which the last governess found intolerable, and I find, frankly, sensible. I would like someone who does not flinch from either." Iris studied him for a moment, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man carrying weight he had not asked for, the ink-stained fingers of someone who did his own estate correspondence rather than delegate it, the careful way he did not look at her too long, as though he had trained himself out of easy familiarity with strangers. "I do not flinch, my lord," she said. "It is, I find, an inefficient use of energy, better spent on solutions." This time the smile reached his eyes before he caught it and put it away again. "Then we shall get on," he said, adequately. It was not a warm welcome. It was, Iris thought, as she was shown to her small but comfortable room above the nursery, something better, an honest one. Her room was simple: a narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing desk beneath a window that looked out over the kitchen gardens toward the dark line of woods beyond. But it was clean, and it was hers, in a way no room at Thornfield had ever been for her mother. She unpacked her single trunk slowly, setting her books upon the small shelf in the order she always kept them, her mother's worn Bible last of all, placed where the last light of evening would fall across its cover. It was a small ritual she performed in every new household, a way of telling herself, without quite admitting it aloud, "I am staying long enough for this to matter." That first night, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar quiet of a house not yet learned by heart, she walked the length of the upstairs corridor and found herself outside the nursery door, where a thin line of candlelight still showed beneath the frame. She knocked softly and found, when she entered, not Louisa but Timothy, sitting up in bed with a candle he had clearly been forbidden to keep lit, turning the pages of a book about frogs with fierce, sleepless concentration. "You're the new one," he said, without looking up, in the flat tone of a boy who had learned not to invest hope in new governesses too quickly. "Miss Ainsley cried within a fortnight. Miss Barrow lasted a month before she said I was unmanageable." Which I looked up in the dictionary, and I don't think it's a fair word for a boy who only wanted to keep a frog. "I have no plans to cry within a fortnight," Iris said, sitting on the edge of the bed uninvited, in a manner she suspected the previous governesses would never have risked. "And I find unmanageable a lazy word, generally used by adults too tired to ask a child what he actually wants. What do you want, Master Timothy, beyond the frog?" He considered this with the great seriousness of an 8-year-old unused to being asked. "I want Louisa to talk again," he said finally, very quietly. "She used to talk all the time. Now she just watches everyone, like she's waiting for us to leave too." Iris felt the small confession settle into her, like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward. "Then we shall have to give her a reason to believe not everyone does," she said, and blew out the candle before either of them could examine too closely how much that promise had already come to matter. The children, when she met them properly that evening, told her more in an hour than the Earl had told her in a week of letters. Timothy, 8, freckled and restless, informed her within the first 5 minutes that the previous governess had been a watering pot who cried when he put a toad in her work basket, and that he did not intend to apologize for it because the toad, in his professional opinion, had also not enjoyed the experience. Louisa, 11, said nothing at all. She sat very straight in her chair, with a book held before her that Iris was fairly certain she was not reading, and watched Iris with the wary, assessing eyes of a child who had learned that adults leave, one way or another, and saw no reason to invest in this one before she too was gone. Iris did not attempt to charm her. She had learned long ago that children, like grief, like guilt, like every uncomfortable true thing, did not respond well to being managed. She simply sat down across from Louisa with her own book, opened it, and began to read in silence, matching the girl's quiet with quiet of her own, until the sun went down, and Louisa, without a word, moved her chair 2 inches closer. It was 3 days later, over a spilled inkwell and a shouting match in the schoolroom that had brought the Earl storming up the stairs expecting catastrophe, that Iris and Nathaniel Ferris found their first real footing with each other. He put the frog in the inkwell. "Miss Hale," Nathaniel said, staring at Timothy with the particular despair of a man who had never once in his life expected to be responsible for a frog-related incident and resented every moment of the education. I put it there to save it, Uncle Nathaniel, Timothy said, with the wounded dignity of the deeply misunderstood. It was going to dry out on the windowsill. Iris, kneeling with a cloth to blot the worst of the ink from the desk before it ruined the wood entirely, did not look up. In future, Master Timothy, I would suggest a saucer of water rather than my ledger of French conjugations. The frog will survive either way. My conjugations will not. Timothy, sensing the shift in the room's temperature, seized the moment to make his case more fully. Miss Hale said herself that the frog wouldn't have wanted to dry out, Uncle Nathaniel. That's practically permission. That is not, in any court of law I am aware of, practically permission, Nathaniel said, though the corner of his mouth had begun to betray him. Miss Hale, I would ask you not to arm my nephew with further rhetorical devices. He is dangerous enough with the ones he already possesses. I merely stated a fact about amphibian welfare, my lord. Any conclusions Master Timothy has drawn from it are entirely his own responsibility. There was a brief, dangerous silence, in which the Earl looked as though he might either laugh or dismiss her on the spot, and then he did neither. He crouched down, picked up the sodden, furious frog from where it had escaped onto the carpet, and deposited it, unceremoniously, into his nephew's cupped hands. Saucer, he said. Now, before Miss Hale decides you're not worth the wages I'm paying her. When Timothy had gone, trailing frog and remorse in equal measure, Nathaniel looked at the ruined ledger and then at Iris, still kneeling with her ink-stained cloth, and something in his face eased. You did not scream, he observed. I have been screamed at by better men than an 8-year-old with an amphibian, my lord. It builds a certain resistance. He extended a hand to help her up. An old habit of manners, she thought, nothing more. And she took it before she could think better of it. His grip was warm, brief, entirely proper, and it left a strange, unwelcome awareness in her palm long after he'd released it. I confess, he said, I did not expect to find the schoolroom a place of alliance so quickly. My sister-in-law went through 4 governesses in as many months before. He stopped himself, the grief still raw enough to catch in his throat, even 18 months on. Before, I had begun to think Ashdown simply unfit for the purpose. Grief makes children strange, my lord, not unfit. Louisa does not need to be coaxed into speaking. She needs to know that when she is ready, someone will still be sitting there. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the old instinct rise in her, the one trained by years of being looked at and found wanting, the one that told her to lower her eyes and make herself smaller. She did not do it. She had promised herself, walking out of every household that had tried to diminish her, that she would not do it again. You speak, Nathaniel said slowly, like someone who has needed that kindness herself, and did not always receive it. It was too near the bone. Iris busied herself gathering the ruined papers rather than answer, and if he noticed the deflection, he was gentleman enough not to press it. I speak, my lord, like a governess with 4 households of experience, she said instead. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have a saucer to inspect. Louisa's thaw, when it came, arrived not through any grand gesture, but through the accumulation of small, patient afternoons. Iris did not press the girl to speak. She simply continued to sit with her, over botany lessons pressing flowers between the pages of old books, over sketches of the kitchen garden that Louisa executed with a careful, quiet talent no one in the house had thought to notice, and waited, the way one waits for a kettle that has not yet decided to boil. It was, in the end, a dead bird beneath the schoolroom window that broke the silence entirely. Louisa found it one grey morning, a small sparrow that had struck the glass in the night, and stood over it with an expression of such total, wordless grief that Iris understood, all at once, that the bird had become, for this child, a smaller and safer thing to mourn than a mother and father lost at sea. We could bury it, Iris said gently, kneeling beside her, properly, with a stone to mark it, if you'd like. Or we could simply let it be and know that some griefs don't need marking to be real. Louisa was quiet for a long moment, turning the small, still body over with careful fingers. Mama always said birds who hit windows didn't understand the glass was there, she said finally, her voice rusty from disuse, but entirely steady. They just saw sky and flew toward it and didn't know there was something in the way until it was too late. It was the first full sentence she had spoken to anyone in 3 weeks, and Iris, recognizing the enormity of the moment, did not make the mistake of remarking upon it. She simply nodded and helped the girl dig a small grave beneath the apple tree and let the words come as they would over the following days, in halting sentences that slowly, steadily, became whole conversations again. By the time autumn had properly settled over Ashdown, Louisa had taken to following Iris through the house with the easy chatter of a child who had decided, at last, that this particular adult was not going anywhere. It was not the frog, nor the ink, nor even Louisa's slow thaw into speech over the following weeks that proved Iris's worth to the household. It was the matter of the Ashdown accounts, discovered entirely by accident on a wet Tuesday, when the estate steward was laid up with a fever, and the quarterly figures sat undone on the study desk, while Nathaniel, unused to the finer details of ledger-keeping, stared at them with the particular hopelessness of a man who had inherited an earldom he understood far better in principle than in practice. Iris had come to fetch a book for Louisa's lesson, and found him swearing quietly at a column that would not balance. "Might I look, my lord?" He glanced up, startled. Not offended, she noted, merely surprised. "You keep accounts, Miss Hale." "I kept my late mother's, from the age of 12, when we had almost nothing to keep. I find figures a great comfort. They are, unlike people, always honest, provided you look at them properly." He gestured, half in exasperation and half in genuine curiosity, to the chair beside the desk. She sat, drew the ledger toward her, and within 20 minutes had found what the steward, competent but overworked, had missed for 2 quarters running. A tenant farm's rents recorded twice in different columns, a coal merchant's invoice inflated by a sum that, when she traced it back through 3 months of deliveries against 3 months of actual usage, could only be explained by fraud or extraordinary incompetence, and she suspected, from the neatness of the discrepancy, the former. "Someone is skimming your coal accounts, my lord," she said, tapping the page. Not dramatically, carefully. A man clever enough to steal slowly is a man who has likely done it before, and elsewhere. Nathaniel stared at the page, then at her, with an expression she was coming to recognize. Not quite disbelief, but the particular respect of a man unaccustomed to being surprised by competence and finding, unexpectedly, that he liked it. He rubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment, the composed, capable Earl she had come to know these past weeks fell away entirely, leaving only a tired, grieving man doing his honest best with a life he had never asked for. "My brother was the one meant to inherit all this," he said quietly. "I was meant for the navy, or the church, or nothing much of consequence at all. A second son with no particular burden beyond enjoying himself. I had made my peace with a small, unremarkable life, Miss Hale. And then a ship went down off the Irish coast, and in the space of 1 letter, I became responsible for an earldom, 2 children who had just lost everything, and ledgers, I understood, only well enough to know that I did not understand them at all." "Grief does not ask whether we are prepared for what it leaves behind," Iris said. "It only leaves it, and expects us to manage." "Yes," Nathaniel said, looking at her with a sudden, searching attention that made her aware, for the first time, of how close together they sat. "I find you understand that rather better than most people I have met since. Most offer condolences, and then look faintly relieved when the subject changes. You do not flinch from it at all. I told you once already, my lord, I find flinching an inefficient use of energy." But her voice had softened, and something passed between them in the quiet study. Not yet affection, not yet anything either of them would have named aloud, but the first thread of a recognition that each had found, unexpectedly, someone who did not require performance in the face of hard things. I inherited this earldom at 29, Miss Hale, with a dead brother, 2 grieving children, and an estate I understood chiefly through my father's complaints about it at dinner. I have been drowning in these ledgers for a year. Then it is fortunate, Iris said, dipping the pen and beginning, without asking permission, to correct the column, that I find drowning men rather difficult to ignore. He laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him, the first she'd heard from him since her arrival, and it changed his whole face, stripped years of careful weariness from it. Is that an offer of employment beyond the schoolroom, Miss Hale? It is an observation, my lord, that a governess who cannot balance her own household's figures against the trickery of a dishonest coal merchant is not much of a governess at all. I shall have this sorted by supper. You may thank me by not calling it charity. He did not call it charity. He called it, over the following month, a great many other things. Invaluable, formidable, and once, quietly, when he thought she had already left the room, remarkable. And by the time the coal merchant was dismissed, the tenant accounts corrected, and the estate's finances set right for the first time since his brother's death, Nathaniel Ferris had stopped thinking of Iris Hale as merely his children's governess, and started, though he did not yet examine the feeling too closely, thinking of her as someone whose absence from a room he noticed. There was, too, the matter of the tenant families, which revealed something of each of them to the other, in ways neither had quite expected. Iris, reviewing the corrected accounts, noticed that 3 cottages on the estate's northern boundary had gone without proper roof repair for 2 winters running, their rents collected in full regardless. She raised it with Nathaniel, not as a criticism, but as a simple statement of fact, the way she raised any discrepancy in a ledger, and watched him receive it, not with the defensiveness she had half expected of a peer unused to correction, but with a kind of grim, self-directed frustration. My brother managed the tenants, he admitted, standing at the study window with his hands braced against the sill. I managed the London house, and largely stayed out of matters here. I did not expect to inherit both a title and an education in it at once, and I confess, I have been better at the former than the latter. Then let us remedy the latter, Iris said, and the following week found them both, much to the visible astonishment of the tenants themselves, unaccustomed to seeing an earl and his children's governess walking the muddy northern lanes together, inspecting roofs, listening to complaints long unheard, and drawing up a list of repairs that Iris costed against the estate's ledgers with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything. It was on the walk back from the last of the cottages, dusk settling purple over the moor, that Nathaniel said, quietly, almost to himself, "My brother would have liked you, I think. He had very little patience for men who let their estates run on inherited habit, rather than honest attention. He would have approved of a governess who marched me through the mud to fix roofs I did not know were broken." "I take that as a very great compliment, my lord," Iris said, "from a man I never had the chance to meet." "Nathaniel," he corrected, for the first time, though it would be some weeks yet before either of them fully claimed the familiarity the name implied. "I think, after today, you have earned the right to it." The trouble, as it always does in houses with servants and neighbors, and nothing better to occupy idle minds, began with a rumor. It was innocent enough in its origin. Iris and Nathaniel had been seen from the drive, walking the garden path in close conversation after the estate steward's replacement had been hired, heads bent together over a letter of recommendation, and by the time the tale had travelled from the stable boy to the housekeeper to the vicar's wife at the neighbouring parish, it had transformed into something considerably less innocent. The Earl of Ashdown, it was whispered at the assembly rooms in the nearest town, was conducting an affair with his own governess. Iris heard of it first from Louisa, who reported it with the blunt honesty of an 11-year-old repeating gossip she did not fully understand. "Mrs. Pruitt says the ladies at the assembly are saying you and Uncle Nathaniel are," she frowned, working out the unfamiliar phrase, "carrying on." "What does that mean?" "It means, Louisa, that people with very little of interest in their own lives have decided to invent something interesting in someone else's. But the invented thing had teeth. By the following week, an aunt of the children's late mother, a formidable widow named Lady Pemberton, who had appointed herself moral guardian of the family's reputation from a comfortable distance of 40 miles, arrived unannounced to inspect the situation, and inspect it she did, with the cold thoroughness of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of finding fault. A governess of unknown family, Lady Pemberton said to Nathaniel over tea, loudly enough that Iris, arranging books in the adjoining room, could not fail to hear every word, conducting herself with such familiarity with an unmarried earl. It reflects poorly on the children, Nathaniel, and worse on you. Surely there are governesses of better breeding to be found. Iris set down the book she was holding very carefully, because her hands had begun, very slightly, to shake, not with hurt, though there was hurt in it, but with a cold, familiar fury she recognized from every drawing room of her childhood, where Cordelia had been made to feel small, for the crime of a daughter Thornfield had not wanted. She did not expect what came next. Miss Hale's breeding, Nathaniel said, and his voice, though quiet, carried the particular steel of a man who did not raise his voice because he had never needed to, is not in question in this house, madam, and I will thank you not to raise it again at my table. She has done more for the running of this estate and the well-being of my niece and nephew in 3 months than the last 4 governesses managed in as many years combined. If gossip in the assembly rooms troubles you, I suggest you correct it, rather than bring it to my door, as though I owe you an accounting of my own household. I speak only out of concern for the children's standing. You speak, Nathaniel said, out of habit, Lady Pemberton, and I have grown tired of it. Miss Hale stays. If that offends the assembly rooms may find other amusement. Lady Pemberton left within the hour, her dignity considerably ruffled, and Iris, who had not meant to be found in the doorway, listening, found Nathaniel's eyes on her the moment the front door closed. The following morning, Iris nearly resigned her post. She had lain awake most of the night, turning the confrontation over in her mind, and by dawn had convinced herself that whatever Nathaniel had said in the heat of the moment, the practical damage to his standing and to Louisa and Timothy's prospects was done, and that the honourable course was to remove herself quietly before the assembly room's gossip could do further harm. She was drafting the letter at the schoolroom desk, her hand steadier than her heart, when Nathaniel found her. He read the half-finished page upside down without asking permission, and his expression, when he looked up, was not anger, but something closer to alarm. You mean to leave? I mean to spare you further difficulty, my lord. A governess who becomes the subject of assembly room gossip is no longer useful to a household that must live within that society, whatever the truth of the matter. I did not defend you yesterday, Nathaniel said, so that you might reward the effort by leaving anyway. Iris. It was the first time he had used her Christian name, and it landed in the quiet schoolroom with unexpected weight. I would rather weather 100 Lady Pembertons than lose the one person who has made this house feel like a home again. If you go because you wish to, not because you believe it spares me anything. It would not. It would only prove her right, and I find I have grown considerably too fond of proving her wrong. Iris set down her pen slowly, the half-written resignation letter suddenly feeling less like prudence and more like the same old instinct to make herself small before anyone else could do it for her. Then I shall stay, she said, on the understanding that I do so because the work is not yet finished, and not because you have flattered me into it. I would not dare flatter a woman who corrects my Latin, Nathaniel said, and the tension in the room broke into something warmer, something that neither of them examined too closely, though both would return to it, privately, more than once in the weeks that followed. You heard that, he said, of the confrontation with Lady Pemberton the previous day. It was not a question. I did. I meant every word of it. I know, Iris said quietly, and found, to her own surprise, that the cold fury had drained entirely out of her, replaced by something far more dangerous, the unfamiliar, unguarded warmth of being defended, openly, without hesitation, by someone who had nothing to gain from it. No one had defended her mother that way. No one had ever defended her that way. "Thank you, my lord. Nathaniel," he said. "I think, after that performance on my behalf, you may call me Nathaniel." The letter arrived on a grey morning in late autumn, and Iris knew before she broke the seal that it would unmake something in her, because the hand that had written her name on the outside was one she had not seen in 19 years, and yet recognized instantly, with the particular certainty of blood remembering blood. Iris. It read, "I know I have no right to write to you, still less to ask what I am about to ask. Your mother is gone, and I was not there, and I have carried that as a wound for longer than you have been alive to know it. I must see you. There are things you deserve to know about why she left, and why I never came after her, and I cannot carry them to my own grave without at least trying to set them right. I will come to Ashdown on Thursday next. I beg you will see me. Your aunt, Marguerite." Iris read it twice, then a third time, her hands entirely steady now, the shaking reserved, apparently, only for lesser injuries than this one. She had known, distantly, that her mother had a sister. Cordelia had spoken of her twice in the whole of Iris's childhood, always with a grief so total that Iris had learned not to ask, but she had never once imagined that sister would come looking for her. She sat for a long while after reading it, the fire burning low in the schoolroom grate, turning the letter over in her hands, as though its weight might change if she held it differently. She thought of her mother's face in the last months of her illness, thin and translucent in the Bath lodging house, and the single time, only once, in 19 years, that Cordelia had spoken her sister's name aloud. "Marguerite," she had said, so quietly Iris had nearly missed it, staring at some point on the ceiling only she could see. "I hope she is warm. I hope, whatever else, that she is warm." It had struck Iris at the time as a strange thing to hope for a sister who had, as far as she understood it, remained comfortably ensconced in a duke's household, while her mother went without coal in a rented room. She had not understood, until this letter, that her mother's hope had never been resentment dressed as generosity. It had been the plain, unconditional love of a woman who had given up her own comfort so that comfort might belong, at least, to someone she loved. She did not tell Nathaniel at first. It was Louisa, sharp-eyed as ever, who noticed the change in her governess over the following days, the distraction during lessons, the way she stood too long at the nursery window, looking out at nothing. "You're sad," Louisa said, with the directness only a child recovering her own voice could manage. "Like when I used to be sad about Mama and Papa." "I am uncertain," Iris admitted, surprising herself with the honesty, which is its own kind of sadness. Marguerite arrived on Thursday, exactly as promised, and Iris, watching from the schoolroom window as an elegant silver-haired woman climbed down from a hired carriage with the visible nervousness of someone approaching a reckoning she had earned, felt every old wound in her chest open at once. She received her aunt in the small morning room, alone, having asked Nathaniel, gently but firmly, to let her face this without an audience, though he made clear, in the particular way he had of saying a great deal with very little, that he would be within call if she needed him. Marguerite did not waste time on pleasantries. She sat across from Iris, hands folded so tightly in her lap that the knuckles had gone white, and told her everything: the war, the separation, the reunion in Thornfield's house, the terror of a woman with no legal claim to her own place in the world, the swap made in an hour of desperate love that neither sister had ever meant as cruelty. "Your mother gave up everything for me," Marguerite said, and her voice broke entirely on the words. "She gave up her place, her husband's regard, her name in that house. She gave up believing you were mine to raise, and I was securing your future by trading places, when in truth she was only ever trading away her own safety for mine, and I let her. I let her walk out that gate with nothing, and I never once came after her, because I was a coward, and because by the time I understood the size of what she'd sacrificed, I did not know how to face her with it. Iris sat very still, absorbing a truth so large it seemed to rearrange the shape of her entire life in the space of a single conversation. She was not, biologically, the daughter of the woman who had raised her. She was Marguerite's blood, and the boy raised as Thornfield's heir, whoever he had grown to be, was Cordelia's true son, a brother she had never known she had. "Why tell me now?" Iris said finally, after 19 years. "Because Thornfield is dying," Marguerite said quietly. "And before he goes, the lawyers require proof of lineage to settle the succession beyond any challenge. The truth will come out soon, regardless of what I do. I did not want you to learn it from a solicitor's letter, Iris. I wanted you to hear it, at least once, from someone who loved your mother enough to have destroyed her by accident, and who has spent every year since regretting it." Iris did not embrace her aunt that day. She was not yet ready for that particular grace. But she did not turn her away either, and when Marguerite rose to leave, Iris walked her to the door and said, with the same steady honesty that had carried her through every hard room of her life, "I will need time, but I do not hate you, Aunt Marguerite. My mother did not raise me to carry hatred for people who were, themselves, only ever trying to survive a man who should never have had that much power over any of you. It was not forgiveness, but it was, perhaps, its first quiet cousin." Before Marguerite climbed back into her hired carriage, she paused on the front step and turned back, hesitant in a way that sat oddly on a woman of her evident breeding and years. "There is one thing more," she said. "Your mother's Bible, the one she carried from Thornfield. Inside the back cover, there is a pressed flower, a moon daisy, that she and I picked together as girls. The summer before the war took everything. I gave it to her the day she left, though I never told her why. I could not say the words I needed to say, so I gave her a flower instead, and hoped she would understand it as an apology I did not yet have the courage to speak aloud." Iris's breath caught. She had found that pressed flower 100 times over the years, tucked into her mother's worn Bible, and had never once known its meaning. Only that her mother had kept it, carefully, through every house they had ever lived in, as though it were the single most valuable thing she owned. "She kept it," Iris said, her voice unsteady for the first time that afternoon. "Every year of her life, however little else we had, she kept it." Marguerite's composure finally broke entirely, and for a moment, the elegant silver-haired woman on the doorstep looked simply like what she was, a sister who had spent 19 years mourning a bond she had believed, wrongly, to be beyond repair. "Then perhaps," she whispered, "there is more left to mend between us than I dared hope." It was not forgiveness, but it was perhaps its first quiet cousin. Nathaniel found her an hour later in the walled garden, sitting on the stone bench beneath the bare apple tree, where she often took her rare moments alone, and he did not ask what had passed between her and the elegant stranger who had left an hour before in visible distress. He simply sat beside her, close enough that his sleeve brushed hers, and waited. "I am not who I believed myself to be," Iris said finally, and told him. All of it, the war and the swap and the sister she had lost twice over, once to distance and once, she now understood, to a truth neither of them had chosen. She had not meant to tell him so completely, but something about the quality of his silence, the way he listened without once looking as though he were waiting for his turn to speak, drew the whole story out of her like a thread pulled from a wound long left to fester. "You are exactly who you have always been," Nathaniel said, when she had finished. "A woman who corrected my accounts, tamed my nephew's frog obsession, and gave my niece back her voice. Blood did not do any of that, Iris. You did." It was the first time he had used her Christian name without asking leave, and she found she did not mind it at all. "I have spent my whole life," she said quietly, "believing I was unwanted from the moment I was born, a daughter no duke wished to claim, and now I learn I was never unwanted at all. I was stolen. Out of love, by two women who could not see any other way to survive the man who owned them both. I do not know which truth is harder to carry. Nathaniel reached over, slowly, giving her every chance to draw away, and covered her hand with his own. His hand was warm, ink-stained even now, and entirely steady. Then do not carry it alone, he said. I find I am rather attached to the idea of you not carrying anything alone, if I am honest, and I have been trying for some weeks now to find a way of saying so that did not sound entirely improper. Iris turned to look at him fully and found none of the careful distance he usually kept, none of the guarded weariness, only a rawness she recognized, because she wore the same expression herself in unguarded moments. You are my employer, she said, though it came out less as protest than as an accounting of obstacles, the way she might list a column of figures that did not yet balance. I am, he agreed, a wholly inconvenient fact, which I intend to remedy at the first opportunity, that does not involve compromising your position before I have properly earned the right to. That is not an answer. No, he admitted, and his thumb moved, slow and deliberate, across her knuckles. It is a promise, which I find I would very much like to make good on, Iris, whenever the world grants us leave to stop being sensible about it. She did not pull her hand away. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself simply be held, steady and warm, and entirely without condition, and found that she did not need to brace herself against it turning cold. I have been afraid, since my brother died, Nathaniel admitted, into the quiet that followed, that I inherited this house and these children entirely unprepared, and that the very best I could hope for was to fail them a little less spectacularly than I feared. You arrived, and within a season, the accounts balance, the tenants are housed properly, and my niece speaks again as though she never stopped. I do not know how to thank a person for restoring an entire household to itself. I am not certain thanks is even the correct word for what I feel. You do not need to thank me, Iris said. I did not restore this house out of duty alone, Nathaniel. I did it because somewhere in the doing of it, it stopped feeling like someone else's house I was merely passing through, and started feeling like one I might actually wish to stay in. Then stay, he said, simply, and the word carried a weight far beyond its single syllable. Not an employer's instruction, but a plea from a man who had learned, the hard way, exactly how much could be lost without warning, and who did not intend to let this particular good thing slip past him for want of saying so plainly. They sat together beneath the bare apple tree until the light failed entirely, saying little more, needing little more. Two people who had each spent long years learning to expect disappointment and were only now, cautiously, allowing themselves to expect something better instead. The summons came a fortnight later, sealed with the black wax of a house in mourning. Edmund Voss, Duke of Thornfield, had died in his sleep, and his solicitors required the presence of every claimant to the succession, including, to the shock of the assembled family, a governess named Iris Hale, whose lineage had been quietly confirmed through the physician's original, unaltered notes, discovered among Marguerite's private papers, and surrendered, at last, to the truth. Iris travelled to Thornfield with Nathaniel at her side, not as her employer now, but as something closer to what neither of them had yet named aloud, and stood in the same cold marble hall her mother had walked out of 19 years before, to face the brother she had never known, and the truth that had shaped every corner of her life without her consent. Julian Voss, 25 and newly styled Duke, was a tall, dark-haired man with Cordelia's same steady grey eyes Iris recognized with a jolt, because she had seen them every morning of her childhood in the mirror, inherited not from the mother who raised her, but, she now understood, from an aunt she barely knew and a sister she had never met. I am told, Julian said carefully, when the solicitor had finished reading the confirmed lineage aloud to a room gone entirely silent, that you are my sister. I am told the same, Iris said, though I confess I have had rather less time than you to grow accustomed to the idea. Marguerite stood at the edge of the room, pale and rigid, waiting for judgment that did not come from either of the children she had reshaped with a single desperate act 19 years before. It was Julian who crossed the room first, extending a hand not to Iris, but to his true mother, Marguerite, who had raised him as her own, with a love that, whatever its origins, had never once been false, and said, quietly, "Nothing in that room changes what you have been to me for 25 years. I would like, if she is willing, to know my sister as well. That is all I ask of today." Julian, for his part, had spent the weeks since his father's death learning a different kind of grief. Not for the cold, exacting man he had called father, whom he had never truly loved, and would not pretend to mourn beyond what duty required, but for the years he now understood he had spent believing himself the fortunate child of the household, never once suspecting that his good fortune had been built upon his true mother's exile. "I used to hear the servants whisper about a first wife who had left in disgrace," Julian said quietly, before the solicitor had finished the reading, while the room still held its breath. "I was told, whenever I asked, that she had proven unable to give my father an heir, and had left rather than face the shame of it. I believed that story for 25 years, Miss Hale. I do not know how to reconcile the woman I was taught to pity with the woman who gave up everything so that my own mother would not be cast out with nothing." "You do not have to reconcile it today," Iris said. "I have had a fortnight longer than you to sit with the truth, and I promise you, it does not finish arranging itself into any comfortable shape for a long while yet." It was Iris who broke first, not with anger, which she had braced for and half expected of herself, but with something gentler, the particular grief of realizing that the family she had lost had never stopped loving her, only failed, catastrophically, to protect her, in a world where a duke's cruelty had made protection nearly impossible to give. "My mother," Iris said, addressing Marguerite directly for the first time since arriving, "loved you enough to give up everything so you would not be cast into the cold. I do not think, in the end, she ever regretted it. Only the years she lost with both of us because of it. I would like to know my brother, and I think, in time, I would like to know you too, Aunt Marguerite. Not as the woman who caused my mother's exile, but as the woman who has clearly spent every year since trying to earn back a forgiveness that was never truly hers to lose." There was no dramatic embrace, no easy resolution wrapped in a single afternoon. Grief and guilt, this old did not dissolve on command. But when the family left Thornfield's cold hall that evening, it was with the first fragile threads of something that had been severed 19 years before, finally, carefully, being rewoven. Before they departed, Julian asked to walk the portrait gallery with her. The same gallery, Iris realized with a slow, cold understanding, where her mother had once taught a small girl the names of ancestors that were not, in truth, her own. Julian stopped before a portrait near the end of the hall, a young woman with steady grey eyes and dark hair, painted not long after her wedding, before Thornfield's cruelty had worn the hope from her face entirely. "Our mother," Julian said quietly. "Cordelia. I commissioned this from an old sketch after I learned the truth. The household had no formal portrait of her. My father saw to that, within a year of her leaving. I did not want her erased from this hall a second time." Iris stood before the portrait for a long while, seeing in the painted woman's face an unmistakable echo of her own. Not the mother who had raised her with such fierce, complicated love, but the aunt she barely knew, whose sacrifice had shaped the whole architecture of her life without her ever once being asked. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not letting the house forget her." "I have spent my whole life," Julian said, "believing myself entirely the son of the woman who raised me, and in every way that matters, I still am. But I find I would like, now, to also be the son of the woman whose blood I carry, whose portrait now hangs where it should always have hung. I do not think loving one need come at the cost of honoring the other." It was, Iris thought, the wisest thing anyone in that cold house had said in 19 years. The 3 weeks between Thornfield and the proposal were quiet ones, filled with the small, ordinary business of a household settling back into its own rhythms. Lessons resumed, ledgers balanced, Timothy's stable cat, finally, against all odds, persuaded to fetch a stick. On the rare occasion it felt like humoring him. But beneath the ordinariness ran a current neither Iris nor Nathaniel spoke of directly, a certainty building slowly toward a moment they both, in their own quiet ways, knew was approaching. Lady Pemberton wrote once more during that fortnight, her tone considerably softened by the news of Iris's confirmed lineage, offering what passed, in her particular idiom, for an apology. Iris read the letter aloud to Nathaniel over breakfast, and the two of them laughed harder than either had in months at the woman's spectacular, unrepentant pivot from moral outrage to eager cultivation of a new acquaintance with a duke's granddaughter. "It is remarkable," Nathaniel observed, "how swiftly breeding becomes unimpeachable once it is inconveniently confirmed to be excellent. I find I care rather less for her opinion now than I did a month ago," Iris admitted, "which is, I think, its own kind of freedom." It was that same evening, walking the garden path in the last mild warmth before the frost properly set in, that Nathaniel drew her toward the apple tree, and Iris, watching the careful, deliberate way he chose his steps, understood before he spoke a single word what was coming. He did not kneel with theatrical flourish, nor produce some rehearsed speech he had practiced before a looking-glass. He simply took both her hands in his, the way he had that first difficult afternoon, and said, with the same steady honesty she had come to trust above all things in him, "I did not fall in love with a duke's daughter, Iris, or a duke's granddaughter, or whatever grand title the solicitors have since decided suits you. I fell in love with a woman who corrected my accounts, defended my niece's silences, and told a marchioness's aunt exactly where she could take her opinions of your breeding. I do not care what blood runs in you. I care that you stay." "That is a very poor imitation of a proposal, Nathaniel," Iris said, though her eyes had gone bright, and her voice was not nearly as steady as she intended. "It is an honest one," he said. "I find I have grown rather tired of pretty speeches that mean less than plain ones. Marry me, not because it would settle the gossip, or please Lady Pemberton, or satisfy any solicitor's ledger. Marry me, because I cannot any longer imagine a version of Ashdown, or of myself, that does not have you steadily, stubbornly, permanently in it." Iris thought of the carriage ride her mother had once taken, forced and afraid, toward a man who saw her only as a means to an heir. She thought of the years of being made to feel, by circumstance and cruelty both, that she was a consolation prize in someone else's story rather than the author of her own. "Yes," she said simply, because after a lifetime of complicated truths, she found she wanted for once to give an uncomplicated one. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you." He kissed her then, in the garden, with the last of the winter light going gold around them, and it held none of the desperation of a bargain struck for survival, and all of the quiet certainty of a choice made freely, by two people who had each, in their own hard way, learned exactly what they were worth. They were married in the spring, in the small stone church at Ashdown, rather than any grand cathedral, with Timothy solemnly presenting the ring on a cushion he had insisted on decorating himself with pressed flowers, and Louisa, speaking freely now, and often, much to the household's fond exasperation, reading the lesson in a clear, unwavering voice that would have made her own late mother weep with pride. Julian came, newly settled into his dukedom, and still learning its weight, and stood as Iris's escort down the aisle, in the absence of any father either of them had ever truly claimed. Marguerite sat in the second pew, weeping quietly into a handkerchief, and when the vicar pronounced Nathaniel and Iris husband and wife, it was Marguerite who reached first for Julian's hand, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that her son took it and held it without hesitation. There was no word from Thornfield's old circle, no acknowledgement from the society that had once whispered about a governess's supposed impropriety. There did not need to be. Iris had spent her whole life being told, by silence and by cruelty both, what she was not entitled to: a father's love, a mother's easy safety, a name that opened doors rather than closing them. She found, standing in the modest stone church with her husband's hand steady in hers, that she no longer required society's verdict to know her own worth. That summer, walking the gardens at Ashdown with her hand resting lightly on the small, still secret swell of her own first child, Iris found Nathaniel exactly where she always found him lately, leaning against the old apple tree, now heavy with fruit, watching Timothy attempt, with limited success, to teach the same long-suffering stable cat to fetch a stick. "You look thoughtful," Nathaniel said, drawing her against his side as easily as breathing. "I am thinking of my mother," Iris admitted. "She used to say there was a moon that never set on me, a mark she traced behind my ear when I was small, though I never understood until Marguerite told me the whole of it, that it was the very thing that once told two sisters apart, and later told them, after everything, that they had never truly lost each other at all." Nathaniel pressed a kiss to her temple, unhurried, entirely certain. "Then I hope," he said, "that whatever moon watched over you through all of it, continues watching a good deal more gently from here." Iris looked out over the garden, her husband beside her, her brother's letters arriving weekly now, with the easy warmth of two people, rebuilding what circumstance had stolen, her aunt's slow, patient forgiveness finally being earned rather than merely asked for, and thought that, for the first time in her life, the story she was living no longer belonged to anyone else's cruelty or anyone else's fear. Louisa came running across the lawn just then, no longer the silent, watchful child of 18 months before, but a girl of 12 grown loud and certain in her own house, waving a letter of her own, an invitation, breathless with importance, to visit her new cousin at Thornfield during the summer holidays, an invitation Julian had extended with the easy warmth of a man determined to build, from the wreckage of his parents' choices, a family that finally kept nothing hidden from itself. "Will we go, Aunt Iris?" Louisa asked, the title new, and worn with evident pride, since the wedding, and Iris found herself laughing at the easy, unremarkable joy of the question, a joy that would have seemed impossible to the frightened, guarded woman who had stepped off a coach at Ashdown's gates less than a year before. "We will go," she said, "and you shall see the very hall where I once thought my whole story had already been decided for me, long before I was ever born to live it." That evening, once the children were abed and the house had settled into its familiar, comfortable quiet, Iris sat at the small writing desk in what had once been her modest governess's room, and was now simply a favorite corner of a much larger life, and took out her mother's worn Bible. She opened it to the pressed moon daisy, faded now to the color of old parchment, and beside it, on a fresh page, began a letter of her own, not to be sent, but to be kept, the way her mother had kept the flower, as a private reckoning with everything that had shaped her. "I do not know," she wrote, "if you can hear me, wherever grief and love finally settle once a life is done. But I want you to know that the daughter you raised in cold rooms and rented lodgings, on nothing but your own stubborn love and 11 shillings sewn into a hem, grew into a woman who wanted for nothing in the end, not because the world was ever kind to her, but because you taught her, in every hard year of your sacrifice, exactly what she was worth. I have found a home, Mother. I have found a family, twice over, in ways I never thought possible. And I have kept your moon daisy safe, exactly as you kept it, because some loves are worth carrying through every winter, however long they last." She closed the book gently, set it upon the shelf where the last light always found it, and went to find her husband and her family and the whole unhurried, ordinary, hard-won rest of her life. It was, at long last, entirely her own.